Okay, as I point out here, in examining, the map from from these first two post Washington elections, it's hard not to notice patterns, right? The South and the West, down here vote one way, and the North and the East tend to vote another way. So in this first election, 1796, Jefferson gets the second number of votes. Actually, what happens in 1800, first of all, do things change by the next election? And it's, the answer is no. But to make matters worse, now Washington is dead, which is to say that Americans can't lean on him for advice. He died in late 1799, in December, just 17 days before the beginning of the century that we will spend a lot of time looking at for the remainder of the semester. But and this says a lot about Washington, by the way, on his death. Pretty interesting. Number one, he made provisions in his will that all of his slaves would eventually be freed after his death. That doesn't mean that all of the slaves at Mount Vernon, but just his. His wife's slaves were not freed. Number two, as one biographer put it, and I quote, self-sufficient as always, his last act was to feel his own pulse at the moment he expired. Now there's an interesting image. George Washington in his last breath, moving his fingers to his wrist to feel his pulse as he died. There's something very Enlightenment, scientific revolution sort of oriented about that sort of way of thinking. I don't know. Interesting image, nevertheless, whether I can interpret it nicely or not. In 1800, everyone says, well, we don't want to have happen again what happened in 1796. So the Jeffersonians cast a ballot for T.J. Jefferson and a ballot for his choice for vice president, a guy named Aaron Burr. But then they are tied. And the Constitution says that Congress has to decide. And to make an incredibly long story short, Burr, being even way more of a scoundrel than Hamilton, and in fact arguably one of the worst scoundrels in American history, Burr starts thinking, hey, I might become president. Of course, he completely ticks off Jefferson, who wins, and he is essentially persona non grata in the new national capital, known at first as the Federal City, but sometimes as Washington City, or it's really later when people really start to refer to it more as Washington, D.C. Burr is not welcome to dine with Jefferson or consult with him because Jefferson does not trust him. These guys, Hamilton and Burr, and the system that allowed them to cause trouble are, of course, scoundrels towards one another as well. And before I get to the duel, I want to go back here and look at something. This is going to tell us, obviously the end of the story before we get to it about what happens to Alexander Hamilton in this duel. What you see here are two obelisks. I think that's how we say it plurally. Alexander Hamilton, who's buried at Trinity Church on Wall Street in New York City. Again, Nicolas Cage's Church with the Secret Back Door in National Treasure. You see here, he's a patriot, he's a soldier, he's a statesman, he's someone whose talents and virtues will be admired long after this marble shall have moldered into dust. This is fantastic. July 12th, 1804, aged 47. And then over here, the much more rural tomb of Jefferson, which I think I've mentioned in class, where it says author of the Declaration of American Independence, which of course would have annoyed John Adams to death, author of the Statute of Virginia for religious freedom, and then founder of the University of Virginia. You know, really, even more than Washington, Hamilton is probably, and maybe even more than Adams, Hamilton is really someone who we think of as the king of the Federalist Party. Author of some of the Federalist Papers, and Jefferson, obviously, the head of his party. But these guys, Hamilton and Burr, and the system, again, that allowed them to cause trouble, don't treat each other very well either. And their scoundrelness, if that is a word, led, of course, if you know this story, to what historians refer to simply as the duel. And this is going to be the final story to emphasize that America around 1800 was trying to figure out how to deal with the whole idea of political parties and what that meant for the nation's future. Burr, by the way, is the grandson of the great awakening preacher Jonathan Edwards, and he brings a sort of Edwards-like passion to politics, but it's definitely skewed. What happened in the duel is this. Aaron Burr, who, again, was the vice president, but not even welcomed in D.C., shot and killed Alexander Hamilton. So think about this even before you know what happened. Joe Biden shoots someone, regardless of the circumstances. What's funny about that is that Dick Cheney, when he was vice president, did shoot someone. That's a whole other story. I'll let you look that one up. But what would be even crazier would be if, Joe Biden challenged the leader of the opposition party. We'll say, Mitch McConnell, who's getting ready to be the new majority leader of the Senate, to a duel. And he shoots him. The comparisons don't match up perfectly, of course, but this is really amazing to people who don't know this story. The vice president actually shot someone dead, and it was not an accident. It's hard to say it was an accident when it is a duel. Although, most of the time what happened in a duel was that people would miss on purpose. The whole point was to show your manhood by just facing someone with a gun. But, didn't work out that way. Burr shot dead the guy who helped Washington write his farewell address. The guy who had been the very first Secretary of the Treasury, one of the chief architects of the Federalist vision for American political order, and Alexander Hamilton. There are all sorts of ironies here, the most important of which is that by dying, Alexander Hamilton may have inadvertently saved the United States because Burr, the VP, was capable of anything, which he proved later in life. Again, this was this guy that was a guy who could have had Jefferson killed and assumed power. And there are some suggestions that he thought about that at one point. He was capable of anything. He was eventually charged with treason because his documents indicate pretty clearly he had attempted at one point to get much of the West to secede from the U.S., and his plan was to set himself up as a president of that new country. So the details of the story, even why they decided to shoot guns at one another, although fascinating, and it's mostly just about one guy slights the other guy in the newspaper, and the other guy comes back with something, and then they're slighting each other's families and so forth. We'll see the same thing with Andrew Jackson and the reason he gets in all of his duels. It's about defending the honor of your family and your name. The details aren't really as important as what I think the duel really illustrates, which is that, like Washington's farewell, the duel reminds us reminds all of us, observers of the past, living in what was the future, obviously, to Washington and Burr and Hamilton and Jefferson and so forth. We're reminded now that there were no certainties for the revolutionary generation alive and well in the early 1800s. They were not really sure what the future held. Some of them believed that their heads still might roll if the English ever returned, guns blazing, as they do in the War of 1812. The point here, as we start discussing the 19th century, is this: America's survival, much less any claims to greatness, was not a given. In 1800, the first year that the federal government occupied its new capital, and previously in New York City and Philadelphia, George Washington was recently buried. Political parties were freshly born, and tensions and concerns about the future of the Republic were plentiful. All right, we'll end there.